Nobody sees the wrong in it but you. So
So
you know,
there,
you the
there
only
was
one.
like,
And then when you hear that Easy E died of AIDS, then you want to know why. Y'all all having butt naked parties, you know.
Some voices don't just sound good, they sound chosen. And when a voice like that walks away from God, the fallout doesn't look normal. It looks like people dying, convinced something was watching them. This is a story about fame ruining artists or money-changing people. Every name in this video started in the same place, the church. Across decades of R&B history, the same signs keep appearing. Artists claiming God stopped listening. Others saying something else stepped in. Voices describing shadows, figures in judgment that never switched off. They were believers who thought they crossed a line they could never walk back from. So as you listen, keep one question in mind. What does it really cost when a sacred voice walks away from God and believes something follows them instead? Ray Charles. Born Ray Charles Robinson in Albany, Georgia, he lost his sight by the age of 7. And in a world that already offered very little mercy to black children, blindness made life even harsher. But inside the Baptist church, Ray was special. Elders spoke about him in hushed, reverent tones. They said the boy could hear things other people couldn't. They said when he sang, it sounded like heaven leaning down to listen. Ray learned gospel music the way other kids learn to speak. The organ, the clapping, the call and response sermons gave his life shape when everything else felt uncertain. Some pastors openly called him touched by God, and that phrase followed him for years. The irony was impossible to miss. A blind boy, unable to see the world, being described as someone who could see heaven more clearly than anyone else. From the start, Ray's identity wasn't just musical, it was spiritual. And that made what came next far heavier than a simple career choice. When Ray left gospel behind, the church didn't see it as growth. They saw it as betrayal. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, rhythm and blues was dangerous music. Church leaders believed it took sacred sounds and twisted them into something sinful. The same rhythms used to praise God were now used to stir desire, drink, and dancing. To them, that wasn't evolution. That was corruption. So when Ray began playing blues piano in clubs and recording secular records, whispers spread fast. He had changed allegiance. People back home said Ray had traded God for applause. They said he took what was holy and sold it to the world. This mattered deeply in black church culture, where gospel singers were often seen as servants, not stars. Ray's success didn't soften that judgment. It sharpened it. The bigger he became, the more the church felt he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And slowly, Ray began to believe that too. This was a quiet distancing. He stopped attending services. He avoided churches while touring. Friends noticed that whenever buses passed chapels or revival tents, Ray would turn his head away. Then came heroin, and with it, something darker than addiction. Ray didn't talk about drugs like a thrill or an escape. He talked about them like distance. According to people close to him, he believed drugs filled the space where God's voice used to be. There are accounts of Ray saying he prayed and felt nothing back. No comfort, no reassurance, just silence. That silence scared him more than judgment ever could. He reportedly told people that God wasn't angry with him anymore. God just wasn't listening. The deeper the addiction went, the further Ray felt from anything sacred. He avoided churches not because he didn't believe, but because he believed too much. He feared walking inside would trigger something final. He once told a fellow musician that if he stepped back into a church, God would judge him immediately, not later, not eventually, right there. That fear shaped his life more than fame did. One moment stands out as a clear breaking point. Years after leaving Georgia, Ray returned to an area near a church he had once performed in as a child. According to accounts passed down in church circles, he attempted to visit quietly. He wasn't looking for a stage. He was looking for closure. Instead, he was stopped by an elderly pastor who recognized him. The pastor didn't greet him warmly. He accused him directly. He told Ray he had sold his soul to rhythm and blues. That phrase hit hard because it echoed what Ray already feared. People nearby reportedly joined in, accusing him of betraying the Lord. Ray didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply turned away and left. People who knew him said something changed permanently after that day. He accepted the idea that he had gone too far to return. From that point on, Ray never entered a church again. Not for worship, not for comfort, not even out of nostalgia. And that decision haunted him. His arrest for heroin possession in the early 1960s led to a brutal detox period. And this is where the stories take on an unsettling edge. Nurses and staff later claimed Ray experienced severe hallucinations. He screamed at unseen figures. He begged shadows to leave him alone. At night, he reportedly cried out for God not to abandon him again. Those words matter. Again. It suggests Ray believed God had already left once, and he was terrified it was happening for good. By the time Ray got clean and reached the peak of his success, the damage wasn't visible on stage. He was celebrated, wealthy, respected. But spiritually, people close to him described him as hollowed out. In rare interviews, when asked about the church, Ray didn't mock it or reject it. He spoke like someone mourning a lost relationship. He once said the church made him, but life unmade him. That sentence carries quiet grief, not defiance, regret. Ray Charles never stopped believing in God. That's what makes his story unsettling. He believed, he just believed, he had crossed a line that belief alone couldn't fix. And that fear didn't disappear with success. It followed him, which raises a disturbing question that leads directly into the next story. What happens when someone believes God is still real, but no longer reachable? Sam Cooke. If Ray Charles drifted away from God slowly, Sam Cooke walked away in a single shocking step. Born in Mississippi in 1931, Sam was raised as a minister's son in a household where faith wasn't optional. It was law. Church was the center of his identity. From a young age, Sam's voice stood out. It was commanding. Gospel audiences believed him. By his early 20s, Sam was the face of modern gospel music, leading the soul stirrers and earning a reputation as the greatest gospel singer of his generation. Pastors called him God's chosen voice. Congregations wept when he sang. His talent was seen as borrowed from heaven. That belief made his next move feel unforgivable. When Sam announced he was leaving gospel for secular music, the reaction was immediate and vicious. Churches banned his records. Ministers warned young singers not to follow his example. Sam was accused of betrayal. What made it worse was how fast it happened. There was no gradual transition. One day he was gospel royalty. The next, he was singing love songs on the radio. To the church, it felt like an overnight abandonment of God. And Sam felt the weight of that judgment deeply. Friends later said he struggled with guilt, even as his career exploded. He didn't deny God, he feared him. Diary entries and testimonies from people close to Sam suggest he believed returning to the church would bring punishment, not forgiveness. Punishment. He reportedly told his girlfriend that if he went back, God would make an example out of him. That belief shaped his behavior. He didn't seek reconciliation. He ran. Fame became movement. Touring became distance. Hollywood only intensified that fear. Surrounded by mystics, spiritual advisors, and people offering alternative forms of protection, Sam began exploring beliefs outside Christianity. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It looked more like someone searching for safety. He was trying to find something that would shield him from the God he believed he had offended. According to diary accounts, Sam spoke about feeling hunted, like something was coming for him, and he didn't know when. That fear peaked on December 11, 1964. Sam Cooke was found dead at a Los Angeles motel under circumstances that have never fully made sense. He was partially clothed. His wallet was missing. Witness accounts contradicted each other. Some said he was aggressive. Others said he was terrified, running from something unseen. Toxicology reports didn't support the narrative of drunken rage, yet that explanation stuck. The scene disturbed investigators because details didn't align. Evidence went missing. Timelines shifted. Photos disappeared. To the church, the interpretation was immediate. This was divine punishment. Newspapers echoed that sentiment, framing his death as God reclaiming what had been loaned. Others disagreed. They saw a frightened man caught in something far more complex than a crime scene. And that's where Sam's story refuses to settle. Was it an accident or something Sam himself believed was inevitable? A reckoning he spent years trying to outrun. His final days suggest a man who never stopped believing in God, but never believed he could be forgiven. And that belief may have shaped the end more than anyone wants to admit. Which brings the story forward to the next figure and an even darker transformation. Because if Sam Cooke ran from judgment, the next man didn't run at all. He challenged it head on. James Brown. James Brown's relationship with God started the same way as so many voices from his era, in survival. Born into crushing poverty in rural South Carolina, faith wasn't philosophy for James. It was structure. Church was the only place where hunger paused, where chaos slowed down, where someone told him his life had meaning. As a child, James sang hymns in worn-down churches with cracked floors and no heat. He clapped, shouted, and prayed because that was how you made it through the week. God was the reason you woke up. People who knew him early said, James prayed before everything, before performances, before meals, before decisions. He believed God kept him alive when nothing else could. That belief stayed with him as he escaped poverty through music. But something changed the moment success arrived. Not gradually, suddenly. When Please, Please, Please became a hit, James didn't thank God publicly. He told people he did it himself. That sentence mattered. God didn't get me here. I got me here. From that point on, gratitude slowly turned into self-worship. James began talking about himself as untouchable, chosen, but not by God, by fate, by destiny, by sheer will. He stopped praying before shows. He mocked the idea of divine protection. Friends noticed the shift immediately. The man who once bowed his head now puffed his chest. And with that ego came fear. Because when you remove prayer, you still need protection from something. That's where the rituals began. James Brown became obsessed with control. especially backstage. He carried mojo bags filled with roots and charms. He pressed them to his forehead before shows. He refused to let people enter his dressing room unless specific actions were completed. 3 breaths, a spin, a whispered chant no one understood. Band members said it was necessity. James believed something followed him, something dangerous, and the rituals kept it away. As the years went on, his belief system became fragmented. He surrounded himself with fortune tellers, spiritual advisors, and people who claimed to cleanse energy. He believed certain colors protected him. Certain arrangements kept him safe. When things went wrong, he didn't blame chance. He blamed spiritual imbalance. During arguments, he admitted it out loud. He once shouted at a ER manager, "God left me when I left the church." Paranoia took hold as drugs entered the picture. Cocaine didn't create the fear, it amplified it. James began saying demons were chasing him. People laughed at first. Then came the infamous 1988 police chase. James barreled through the streets with officers following, later claiming he wasn't running from police. He was running from demons. His bandmates later admitted he believed that fully. He wasn't joking. He thought something unseen wanted him. In his final years, James's health declined, but the fear didn't. Nurses reported him mumbling about shadows, about figures standing in corners, about God not listening anymore. One nurse later said, James grabbed her arm and whispered that he stopped praying years ago, and now God wouldn't hear him. That sentence echoed something heard before. Not disbelief, regret. His funeral was massive, loud, gold, a celebration that felt almost excessive. His body was paraded in a golden casket through Harlem. Music blasted. People danced. Some attendees said it didn't feel like mourning. It felt like ritual, like an offering, a final performance. For a man who replaced prayer with power, the end came wrapped in spectacle instead of silence. And that leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. If James Brown believed God left him when he stopped praying, what happens when someone never stops believing but believes God is terrifying instead of loving? That takes us to the next story, and it's darker than anything James ever faced. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye didn't grow up fearing sin. He grew up fearing God. His childhood home in Washington, D.C. was ruled by his father, a Pentecostal preacher who believed discipline was devotion. Scripture wasn't comfort in that house. It was weaponized. Marvin learned early that God watched constantly and punished severely. Love came with conditions. Silence came with threat. Music was Marvin's escape, but even that wasn't safe. He sang in church because he had to. His voice brought praise from the congregation, but judgment followed him home. His father saw music as sacred only if it stayed obedient. Anything else was rebellion. That shaped Marvin deeply. Faith didn't feel like protection, it felt like surveillance. When Marvin entered the world of secular music, guilt followed him everywhere. His journals from the early 1960s reveal a man constantly afraid he was betraying God. He wrote that every song outside the church felt wrong. Not exciting, not liberating, wrong. He believed heaven was watching, waiting for him to slip too far. That fear didn't disappear with success. It intensified. As Motown polished him into a star, Marvin felt split in half. He told friends he was living 2 lives, and one of them was a lie. He never clarified which. That internal war pushed him toward rituals. Not church rituals, personal ones. Candles had to be placed precisely. Rooms had to be arranged symmetrically. He believed imbalance invited spiritual attack. As drug use escalated, paranoia followed. Marvin believed dark figures watched him. He believed forces moved through rooms when he wasn't looking. He prayed obsessively one day and cursed God the next. His journals reveal rage directed not at the devil, but at God himself. He wrote that God made him wrong, not sinful, wrong, like a mistake that couldn't be fixed. By the late 1970s, Marvin believed the devil listened better than God. That sentence alone shows how twisted his faith had become. He didn't stop believing. He just believed he was trapped between two forces, neither of which wanted him whole. When he returned to his parents' home in the early 1980s, friends saw retreat. Marvin saw confrontation. He believed that house was where judgment lived. Arguments with his father became constant, violent, spiritual. Marvin told his brother he shouldn't have come back because God was waiting for him there. On the day before his death, Marvin reportedly said God wanted something from him, and it wasn't his music. Hours later, his father picked up a gun and pulled the trigger. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. A man raised to fear God was killed by God's messenger in his own mind. Some called it tragedy, others called it judgment. Those closest to Marvin believed something else. He spent his entire life fighting God, not because he hated him, but because God had never felt safe. And that leads to the next chapter, where fear doesn't come from anger or rebellion, but from silence. Because the next voice didn't shout at God or run from him. He believed God simply disappeared. Donny Hathaway. Hathaway's story begins with devotion so deep it scared him. From childhood, Donny was spiritually sensitive in a way people around him struggled to understand. Raised in gospel tradition, trained formally in music, and known as a choir prodigy, Donny believed his voice was a direct line to God. Singing wasn't performance to him, it was connection. And the idea that that connection could ever break terrified him more than failure, fame, or death. People close to Donny said he prayed constantly, not casually, obsessively. He prayed before recording sessions, after rehearsals, late at night when everyone else slept. He talked about God like someone who could walk out of the room if ignored for even a moment. Unlike others who drifted from faith, Donny clung to it tightly, too tightly. His fear wasn't punishment. His fear was silence. That fear became real in the early 1970s. Donny began telling friends that something felt different when he sang. He said the room felt watched, not judged, watched. He described a presence behind him in studios, especially when the lights were low. When he closed his eyes during takes, he said he could feel someone standing in the corner. At first, people assumed stress. Fame had come fast, and pressure was heavy. But Donny didn't describe it like stress. He described it like replacement. He told bandmates that God wasn't responding the way he used to. The prayers felt unanswered. The connection felt hollow. And in that hollow space, something else seemed to be listening. During a rehearsal in 1974, Donny abruptly stopped singing and said, "God isn't in the room today. Only the other one is." The room went silent. No one asked what he meant. Everyone felt something had crossed the line. Doctors later diagnosed Donny with paranoid schizophrenia, but that explanation never matched how Donny understood his own experience. He didn't believe he was sick. He believed he was under spiritual attack. That belief is why he refused medication. He said it blocked his connection to God. He believed treatment would cut the line completely. To Donnie, clarity mattered more than comfort, even if clarity came with terror. As the years passed, his world narrowed. He believed people were stealing his music through supernatural means. He believed his songs were being used against him. He believed voices spoke not from inside his mind, but from somewhere above it. Medical notes from hospital visits mentioned spirits, angels, and demons described with equal certainty. Donnie didn't feel confused. He felt targeted. In January 1979, during recording sessions in New York, Donnie's fear intensified. He arrived trembling, whispering prayers under his breath. He stared at the ceiling as if waiting for something to break through. At one point, he leaned toward a studio engineer and said, "God isn't here, something else is." That was the last session he ever attempted. 2 days later, Donny Hathaway was found dead beneath the 15th floor window of the Essex House Hotel. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. But the details never sat right with people who knew him. There was no note, no fingerprints on the windowsill. Witnesses reported hearing Donnie arguing in his room shortly before the fall, arguing with someone, yet he was alone. Hotel staff later said it sounded like two voices, one loud, one responding. That detail was quietly dismissed, but it lingered, especially among those who knew Donnie's fear wasn't loneliness. It was abandonment. After his death, friends who entered the room described it the same way. Cold, empty, not peaceful, abandoned, as if something had left before Donnie did. Roberta Flack, his closest musical partner, later said the room felt wrong, like God had already gone. Whether Donnie's end was illness, spiritual terror, or something else entirely, one truth remains. He died believing God had gone silent and something else had taken his place. And that idea leads directly into the next story, because the next voice didn't fear silence. She feared ownership. Minnie Riperton. Minnie Riperton's voice didn't sound human, and people noticed from the beginning. Musicians whispered about it long before she became famous. Her whistle register didn't just reach high notes, it floated above them. Sound engineers said it behaved strangely on tape, like it came from somewhere else in the room. Some joked about it, others didn't joke at all. Minnie grew up singing in church on Chicago's South Side, surrounded by strict spiritual structure. Her mother insisted on prayer before performances. God was central. But as Minnie entered the experimental music scene of the early 1970s, her curiosity widened. She began attending spiritual gatherings that weren't Christian. Healing circles, energy readings, silent rituals involving candles, bowls, and sound. These weren't wild or theatrical. They were quiet, focused, intentional. Friends said Minnie was chasing understanding. She wanted to know where her voice came from. During recording sessions, she sometimes paused mid-take and said the air felt different. On one occasion, she whispered that something passed through her when she hit certain notes. Engineers blamed drafts. Musicians didn't. They noticed her eyes change when she sang. Not dramatic, distant. By the time her album Perfect Angel was recorded, Minnie had begun speaking about her voice in detached terms. She said she was holding it, not owning it. In interviews, when asked how she maintained such an impossible range, she smiled and said the voice wasn't hers. That line unsettled people. It wasn't metaphorical. She said it plainly. In 1976, Minnie was diagnosed with breast cancer. Instead of grounding her spiritually, the diagnosis intensified her questions. She visited faith healers and spiritual practitioners, alongside medical treatment. She asked one healer whether her gift came from God or somewhere else. The healer refused to answer. That refusal haunted her. In her final years, Minnie developed rituals she called vocal offerings. She lit white candles, surrounded herself with mirrors, and sustained high notes until the flame flickered. Her husband later admitted she believed the voice carried spiritual energy that needed balance. Fed, released. She didn't explain what happened if it wasn't. In her last days, nurses reported Minnie whispering prayers, then switching into chants they couldn't recognize. She stared upward often, asked if God still wanted her back. That question is the most unsettling part of her story. Not fear of death, fear of return. When Minnie Riperton died in 1979, rumors spread quickly. Some claimed her recordings contained tones no human throat could produce. Others said her voice was borrowed and had to be given back. To fans, she was a miracle. To those who knew her spiritually, she was a vessel who never stopped wondering who filled her. And that question opens the door to the final chapter. Because the next man didn't wonder where his gift came from. He believed God gave it to him, then cursed him for using it. David Ruffin. David Ruffin's war with God started long before fame ever found him. It started in childhood, under a version of faith that didn't offer comfort or safety. Ruffin was born in rural Mississippi into a family ruled by strict religious authority. His father was a minister, but not the gentle kind. Religion in that house came with violence, fear, and punishment. Scripture wasn't guidance, it was threat. God wasn't someone who protected you. God was someone who watched, waited, and punished. David grew up singing in church because he had to. Revival tours, forced performances, long sermons, followed by beatings shaped his understanding of faith early. He later described his childhood as a cage built out of Bible verses. That image matters, because cages don't disappear when you leave them. They get carried. When David joined the Temptations in the mid-1960s, the church ran from it like someone escaping surveillance, but running brought paranoia. David didn't stop believing in God. He became obsessed with him, specifically with the idea that God was watching him constantly, judging every decision, recording every sin. Friends said David hated the idea of divine surveillance. He wanted privacy. He once stared into a dressing room mirror and whispered that he didn't want God watching him that night. People laughed. David didn't. As fame grew, his anger toward God intensified. This was inversion. God was everywhere, and David resented that presence deeply. During prayer circles on tour, he snapped at bandmates for calling God's name. He shouted that they didn't know what God had done to him. That moment marked a shift. David wasn't drifting from faith, he was fighting it. Drug use amplified the conflict. Cocaine didn't create David's paranoia, but it gave it volume. He began saying God had cursed his voice, that the gift was given and then taken back as punishment. When his vocals started to crack in the early 1970s, doctors blamed strain. David blamed God. He believed the decline was spiritual retaliation. To protect himself, David turned to ritual, not prayer, protection. He carried talismans in his pockets, wore chains he believed shielded him from divine anger. He insisted on dim lighting in studios, claiming bright light attracted judgment. Engineers recalled him refusing to record unless the room felt spiritually quiet. That word came up often. Quiet meant safe. Loud meant watched. He visited fortune tellers and spiritual advisors who promised protection from judgment. But nothing worked for long. After Tammy Terrell's death, the woman he loved deeply, David became convinced God was punishing him directly. He told his brother that God took her to hurt him. That belief shattered whatever balance he had left. From that point on, David openly dared God to act, to finish it, to strike him if he was watching. That dare sounded like exhaustion. Friends said David believed he was already damned. Arrests, overdoses, and violent outbursts followed, each one reinforcing his belief that he was living under a curse. By the late 1980s, David talked openly about being judged in public spaces. He said churches stared at him when he passed. He avoided crosses, then wore one obsessively. On June 1, 1991, David Ruffin collapsed in Philadelphia after heavy drug use. But the final moments remained disturbing. His body was dropped at the entrance of a hospital by someone who never identified themselves. Some reports said he was already cold. Others said he was clutching a crucifix chain he hadn't worn in years. That detail haunted people who knew his story. The chain symbolized the God he feared and challenged. Officially, his death was ruled an overdose. But spiritually, those close to him believed something else. They believed David spent his life daring God to prove he was watching. And in the end, David believed God answered. Whether that belief was truth or tragedy doesn't change one thing. David Ruffin didn't die at peace. He died locked in a battle that began in childhood and never ended. And when you step back from David's story, something uncomfortable becomes clear. His life wasn't unique. It followed a pattern seen again and again. Which brings us to the final chapter. Because once you connect these stories, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Pattern analysis. When you line these stories up side by side, they stop looking random. Different lives, different eras, different personalities, but the same shadow moves through all of them. Almost every one of these artists began in the church. Their voices were shaped by worship before fame ever touched them, but their faith was fear-based. God was introduced as authority, surveillance, judgment. That shaped how they reacted when success pulled them into the world. Leaving the church felt like exile. And instead of replacing faith with nothing, they replaced it with substitutes. Prayer faded first. That's important. None of them stopped believing God was real. They stopped believing God was reachable. And into that gap came rituals. Each artist built private systems to replace the protection prayer once gave them. Paranoia followed naturally. Feeling watched, feeling followed, feeling judged. Some called it demons, some called it energy. Some didn't name it at all. But all of them described the same sensation. Something was present. Something was listening. And it wasn't kind. Then came fear of judgment, not in the afterlife, in real time. They believed punishment could arrive suddenly, through illness, through violence, through loss, through death. And many of their deaths came wrapped in unanswered questions, inconsistencies, final words filled with fear instead of peace. None of these stories offer clean conclusions. That's what makes them disturbing. These were people who couldn't escape him. They fell because belief never stopped watching them back. And that leaves one final question hanging over everything. Were these artists punished, cursed, or simply human beings crushed by a faith that taught fear before? Love? Now here's what to do next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Drop a comment with the name that haunted you most.